Welcome. My name is Randy Beardsley, and today I'd like to talk about Article 1 of the Beardsley Doctrine. Article 1 deals with the freedom of speech. Without the freedom of speech, it becomes almost impossible to protect any of the other freedoms that you have. I'll explain in detail why Article 1 is important, what's wrong today, what needs to be done moving forward. Let's start by reviewing Article 1. Article 1. We reject the double standard dictated by the media and enforced by the government and the schools that allows some speech and ideas to be protected by the First Amendment, while other speech and ideas aren't and are labeled as misinformation or hate speech. Expression of thought or speech that differs from the media and the government's often incorrect view of our world is not racism, misinformation, or hate speech. Freedom of speech is not an exclusive right granted only to those who agree with the government. We support the First Amendment right that guarantees the freedom of speech and thought for all Americans. Now, why is this important? God granted man the right of free will, and with free will came the right of free speech and thought. Our forefathers made freedom of speech part of the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights because they understood that no other right can be defended and protected if the freedom of speech and thought are taken away. They wisely knew that some men, they believe that they can replace God as the giver of all things that are good and true. These men believe that they, not God, can grant the right of free speech and thought, and that they can grant it only to those that agree with them and withhold it from those that don't. But our forefathers knew that throughout history, and even in the present, the suppression of speech and thought has always been used as a weapon by the corrupt to silence the population and strip the people of their God-given rights. Our forefathers understood that protecting man's fundamental right to self-determination can only be fulfilled if people have the ability to voice their ideas, their dreams, their visions, and their opinions. The right of free speech is necessary to realize and protect all the other God-given and constitutionally protected rights that we have. Without free speech and the ability to examine every possible solution to solve our problems, we will get more of the same failure that we've had over the last 50 years. More debt, more war. I already had to add a new conflict to this slide since we last discussed our endless war strategy. More welfare, more lost jobs, and more illegal and legal immigration, to just name a few of the failures perpetuated when speech and thought are manipulated and silenced. The premise of successful government is based upon the truth that the government exists by the people and for the people. But a government's destruction of the right of free speech and thought demands allegiance to a different premise. That premise is that people exist merely to serve as serfs to the will of the government. This is false. This dangerous and failed belief that elected government officials can silence its own citizens by criminalizing it, ignoring it, censoring it, and calling it propaganda, misinformation, or hate speech is not only wrong, it's also unconstitutional. The belief that only wise elected government officials and media types are smart enough to tell us how to think, what to think, and what we can say only confirms their belief in our status as subjects, not citizens. Silence and free speech becomes necessary when leaders can no longer lead based on the merit of their vision or the results of their policies. In the minds of those pursuing personal power and wealth, rather than what's best for our country, there can be no competing ideas or ideologies. Why? Competing ideas and ideologies carry the risk of exposing the failed ideas and policies of that leader. If people recognize that there's a better way, they will demand new leaders that will provide solutions that will benefit all the people in the country, not just a select few. These competing ideas, they must be silenced and crushed by whatever means are possible. And one of the most often used weapons to accomplish this is the theft of free speech. Bottom line, banning speech is the start of the end of democracy and the beginning of tyranny. What's wrong today? At an unprecedented rate, free speech and thought is being eroded in our country and countless other supposedly democratic countries. It is fundamentally done two ways. First, there's an insidious loss of Americans' right to free speech, and second, there's the blatant loss of this right. I think we all know and have seen the blatant loss method. With this approach, the government silences citizens by one of several unconstitutional ways. One way is to create new laws that prohibit certain speech and thought. They just make certain things illegal to say. Say the wrong thing, you may end up in jail or paying stiff penalties. Another way is through censorship. The government, working with media and tech companies, can simply ban and remove any speech, thought, or idea that they disagree with from public view. Another way is through intimidation. They can investigate you, threaten you, and incite hate and violence against you if you dare to say what they are forbidding you to say. Another way is to marginalize anyone who presents ideas that they deem acceptable. This is done by calling them racist, unpatriotic, domestic terrorists, or claiming the ideas, misinformation, or dangerous. Another form of blatant assault on your right to free speech is through coercion of schools and businesses to suspend, fire, and punish any student or employee who exercises their right of free speech to convey a point of view or thought that's no longer permitted. Even another tactic is by incentivizing organizations, schools, and businesses to punish free speech and promote failed ideas and policies in exchange for some benefit or preferential treatment. You frequently hear this shameful dialogue out of our business and our school administrators. If you've been paying attention at all over the last several years, you've seen countless incidents of blatant attacks on your right of free speech. In the face of the failing results of their leadership and policies, they believe that some people don't have a right to free speech. They don't have a right to challenge or disagree with the direction of our country. Another good example of a blatant loss is just what happened in the Ukraine. The democratic country of the Ukraine just recently shut down 3 TV stations. The crime was that Ukrainian television was reporting information that the current party in charge of the government didn't agree with. The Ukrainian government also banned 11 political parties from any activity. Political parties like Democrats or Republicans just banned. The reason for banning any political activity for about 20% of the elected members of the Ukrainian parliament, the government didn't want the Ukrainian people to hear any information, even from elected officials that represent the Ukrainian people, that they didn't agree with. In so many of today's situations, there's only one solution that'll be heard, the government solution. In no discussion, no debate, not even a sound shall be uttered if the government doesn't agree with it. This is the blatant loss method. Let me show you how it works in practice. When our country faces a problem or decision that must be made, there are countless solutions that we can pick from. All the solutions across the spectrum of the ideas look like this. But not all ideas are good ideas. Some are just awful for America. They fall over here in the red. Others are just bad for us. They're shown in yellow. While other solutions, if implemented, will have a good outcome for Americans. They're shown here in light green. Other solutions, shown in green, they have a great outcome. They benefit America and Americans if implemented. But when the blatant loss of free speech is used against Americans, some great ideas, they just get criminalized, they go away. Others go missing by way of intimidation. Others disappear from the discussion due to coercion. Some good ideas get censored and they go away, and yet others get marginalized away as misinformation, hate speech, or dangerous. All the solutions that offered positive benefits seem to have been removed from the potential solutions. But guess what? Because we still have a democracy, you still get the illusion that you get to pick the solution. But the problem is, the only solutions you're allowed to pick from range from having bad outcomes to awful outcomes for our country. This is how we have sustained 50 years of consecutive failure in our country. The second way your right of free speech is lost is much more insidious, and thus the name. Let me show you how this works. For any situation, conflict, or decision that needs addressed in our country, there's the same wide spectrum of solutions that can be used to address the problem. That spectrum has the same varied outcomes, ranging from awful to great for each potential solution. Now, with an insidious loss, you're only presented with solutions that have a bad outcome for America. All the other solutions with a good outcome, they're just gone. Free speech isn't really taken away, it's just simply ignored, like it never happened. The government, our schools, and the media present only the options over there on the left, that will result in the difference between awful performance and bad performance. All the solutions with good outcomes for America are simply ignored like they never happened, with the hope that you'll be too busy working to realize that there are better solutions. They tell you you have to pick one of the solutions presented, bad or awful, with the inevitable result of a bad outcome that perpetuates failure in our country. This is the insidious loss. Let me give you a good example of this. Let's look at the current Ukraine crisis, since it's getting all of our government and the media's attention. Here's the spectrum of possible solutions to the conflict. One solution is just that we should be neutral and just stay out of it. Lots of Americans feel that way. That's an option you haven't heard. Another solution is we could take a lead role as a mediator to help bring the parties together to work out a compromise to stop the bloodshed. A lot of Americans like this solution also, but it's never even been presented as a viable option. Some people think we should put sanctions on both of these governments to incentivize them both to compromise to find a solution and stop the death and destruction. There are even others that believe that if we were better educated about the conflict, that we should be supporting Russia. But you certainly haven't heard that idea. There are other ideas also, but Americans have only been presented with two options that are over there. The first solution is to support Ukraine and take money from our families and the people that need help in our country, send that money and arms to Ukraine to escalate the conflict to ensure more death and destruction for everybody. This is the let's throw more wood and gasoline in the fire to help put it out solution. It's a bad option with a bad outcome for Americans and Ukrainians alike. The other option is even worse, to support Ukraine and send money, arms, and our children off to Ukraine to fight the war. With our money and our kids, that will ensure more death and destruction and the death of our children. That option lands here in the spectrum. Awful. So we have to make a decision. But we have all the other options, most of them with good outcomes for everyone involved. They're gone. What happened to them? They've simply been ignored and hidden. They've been eliminated from the potential list of solutions. This is how the insidious loss of your right of free speech and self-determination works. We were told these are the only options to choose from. It doesn't necessarily prohibit free speech. It just ignores all the solutions that may be beneficial for Americans and presents and promotes a small number of failed solutions to pick from. You still get to pick, but once again, you're left to pick between a bad outcome and a worse outcome. This means more failure for you and our country. Our government continues to behave like they believe that you should only be able to think and say things that they deem acceptable. They seem to believe that they have the right to tell you how to think, what to think. They want to restrict your thoughts and speech to things that perpetuate failure and increases their wealth and power at your expense. They believe that free speech is an exclusive right granted only to those who agree with them. Whether intentional or not, they are using both blatant and insidious means, and by doing so, they've outlawed free discussion on many topics. And if those discussions were to take place, it would become obvious that their plan for America is not the best one. Good ideas appear not to even be allowed to be debated for fear that if American people were fully informed of all the solutions to our problems, that they certainly would not choose the solutions that our government is implementing. Americans must never accept being reduced to pawns in their own country. We must never give up our right to free speech and the platform it provides for us to protect all our other rights. So what must be done? Freedom of speech and ideas must be restored to all people, regardless of their beliefs. This is a God-given and constitutional right. No one should have to fear for their job or their safety for using their right of free speech and expression. Retaliation by the government, media, schools, and employers for freedom of expression that they don't agree with is illegal. And enforcement of these unconstitutional acts violate the oath to God that every person in the military and law enforcement has sworn to defend. This infringement on our right to free speech must be stopped. All words and phrases are protected for use by all Americans, and all ideas must be allowed to be discussed to ensure that all the ideas are heard and considered based on their merit. Insidious methods that ignore real solutions to our problems must be replaced with open discussion of each and every solution. Blatant methods of criminalize and censor free speech and ideas and label some solutions as hate speech, misinformation, unpatriotic, and dangerous. It's these methods that must be recognized as the real threats to democracy. Failed ideologies that promote the idea that only those wise government officials and media types are smart enough to discern fact from fiction, while us regular folk lack the intelligence to know any better. They're as false now as they've always been. Ideas like this must be rejected. Speech and thought that are censored and called dangerous misinformation today by the media and our government has all too often becomes tomorrow's truth. Politicians, teachers, media types, business leaders, and whoever else believe that they can replace God and determine what rights that you're entitled to receive, they must be replaced with Americans who believe in our Constitution and our right to free speech. Now, I know there's a lot that we have to do, but some people just want to talk about what's wrong, while others are resigned to our demise and say nothing can be done. There are even some that believe leaving our country is the best solution for their family. But me, I'm not going anywhere. My forefathers built this country. They gave their life for this country, and I serve this country. This is my country. Nobody's going to tell me whether I'm allowed to exercise my God-given and constitutionally protected rights to free speech. It is true that the enemies of our country, they're well-funded, they're deeply entrenched. But they lack in numbers and they rely on intimidation, censorship, and economic coercion of good Americans to enforce their failed ideas and policies upon the majority. I believe that every patriotic American can and must participate if we are to preserve a future for our country, for our children. If you're an American like me that just isn't ready to forfeit your right to free speech and your right to determine the outcome of your future, and you just aren't content to be part of the generation that sat back idly and betrayed our children's and grandchildren's future, then I'm inviting you to join me and the others who've already started on this journey. If you haven't done so already, I urge you to take the first step also by taking time to watch America 50 Years of Failure, Parts 1 and Part 2. This two-part series outlines clearly and concisely how the leadership of our country has failed us for 50 straight years. And then watch the Beardsley Doctrine to see what specific policies we reject and what policies we'll replace them with as we move forward. In the meantime, we'll continue to work our way through each one of the other 19 articles in the doctrine on our way to establishing a foundation that we're going to need to launch the action plan whose goal is to end the failed policies and division in our country, the press plan. I'll see you next time for Article 2.